All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're taking a deep look at Biocon, a company that's really trying to make affordable healthcare a reality.
And they've got this really interesting strategy they call the multiplier effect.
Yeah, the multiplier effect, right?
It's like they're not just focusing on one thing. They're involved in generics, biosimilars, and even research services.
It's almost like building a whole healthcare ecosystem, right?
That's a great way to put it.
Their executive chairperson, Karen Mazumdar-Shaw, talks about how this approach helps them tackle health inequity around the world.
It's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is trying to balance the risks while also unlocking value across all these different areas they're working in.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Exactly. We get to see if this multiplier effect is actually working, like, is it really making a difference?
Yeah.
Because think about it. Biocon started off as a small enzyme company like 45 years ago.
Wow, 45 years.
And now they're this global biopharma player. I mean, they're in India, Malaysia, the US, Europe.
That's a lot of ground to cover.
It really is. And that global reach, I think, is a key part of their strategy.
Absolutely.
We'll get into that a bit later and see how it's all impacting their financials and their overall growth. But first, I have to ask you, did you know that Biocon is the very first company to get a generic glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonist approved?
GLP-1.
Yeah, or GLP-1 for short, in a major regulated market.
That's a big deal.
It's huge, especially when you consider the potential of the GLP-1 market.
Right. These are medications for type 2 diabetes, and they've been shown to be very effective.
So this approval basically means that potentially millions more people who have diabetes could actually have access to these medications.
At a much more affordable price, too.
Yeah, exactly.
And this comes at a time when the global pharmaceutical market is booming.
I was going to say.
Like, it's projected to reach USD 1,888 billion by 2028.
Wow.
With a growth rate of 5.9% annually.
5.9%. That's a massive market.
It's a huge market, and Biocon seems to be strategically positioning themselves to really benefit from that growth.
Especially with their strong focus on biosimilars.
Right, particularly in oncology and immunology.
We are two of the fastest growing areas in healthcare, right?
Exactly. Oncology is expected to grow at a rate of 14–17% annually, and immunology between 205% through 2028. And this seems to be paying off for Biocon, considering their recent revenue jump in biosimilars.
Speaking of revenue, let's take a look at their financial performance in fiscal year 2024.
Yeah, sounds good.
Their total revenue went up by a pretty impressive 35%, reaching $156,212 million. But what's really interesting is that biosimilars were the star performer.
They were.
With a whopping 58% increase in revenue.
That's a huge jump.
It is. I'm guessing the acquisition of Viatris's biosimilar business played a role in that.
Oh, absolutely. That acquisition really expanded their portfolio and their market reach. Plus, it gave them access to all sorts of valuable infrastructure.
It's like a classic example of how a strategic acquisition can really accelerate growth.
It really is.
So they're clearly making a big bet on biosimilars. But what about their other areas? How did generics and research services perform?
Research services, which they run through their subsidiary Syngene, actually grew at a very respectable 9%,
Okay.
which is not bad at all. But generics saw a much smaller increase, just 1%.
So you kind of wonder, are generics becoming less of a focus for Biocon?
As they put more emphasis on those biosimilars.
Yeah, exactly.
It's something to keep an eye on for sure. And, while that 58% jump in biosimilar revenue is really impressive,
Yeah.
it is worth noting that it includes a one-time gain of $3,500 million from divesting some non-core business units.
Oh, interesting.
So they're not just growing through acquisitions, they're also streamlining their portfolio, getting rid of things that aren't essential.
So they can focus on what they're really good at.
Exactly. It's a very smart move, especially in an industry as dynamic as pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about profitability, because revenue growth is great, but it has to translate into actual profits.
Right. It all comes down to the bottom line.
Exactly. So their EBITDA, which is a measure of their operating profitability, increased by a significant 44% to reach $41,642 million.
Okay. And what about their profit after tax, their PT?
That also saw a nice boost, going up 31% to $10,300 million. But there's a little detail here we should mention. This PT figure includes a one-time gain of $45 million from an exceptional item.
Got it.
So we need to keep that in mind when we're evaluating their recurring profitability.
Makes sense.
Now let's move on to R&D investments because, in pharmaceuticals, innovation is absolutely
It's
essential.
the lifeblood of the industry.
Exactly. Biocon's gross R&D investment increased by 3%, reaching 11,614 million.
Okay, so that's a decent amount, but it seems like a fairly small increase compared to their overall revenue growth. So is that really enough for them to stay competitive over the long term?
That's a really good question. It's worth pointing out that Biocon Biologics is actually one of the companies that spends the most on R&D in the entire Indian pharmaceutical industry.
Wow, okay.
And their R&D investments in FY24 represented a significant 10% of their total revenue.
That's a pretty substantial chunk of change.
It is. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about Biocon's global footprint.
Yeah, we know they've got a presence in both regulated markets and emerging markets.
Right.
But I'm curious to know where they're actually generating most of their revenue. How does that geographical mix break down?
Well, the majority of their revenue, a surprising 76%, actually comes from regulated markets, while emerging markets account for the remaining 24%.
Huh, so that means they're really relying on those developed markets like the US and Europe.
Exactly. They're using their global reach to tap into those really lucrative Western markets.
Makes sense.
And their strategy seems to be centered around further expanding their presence in these regions.
Especially by leveraging the infrastructure they gained through that Viatris acquisition.
Right. It's a smart move considering the higher pricing power and the more stable regulatory environments you find in those markets.
Definitely. Now, let's take a look at their financial health. How are they managing their debt and their overall liquidity?
Well, it seems like they're taking a very prudent approach, focusing on reducing their debt and strengthening their balance sheet.
Yeah, I remember reading that Biocon Biologics prepaid a significant portion of their long-term debt, something like USD 250 million, if I recall correctly.
You got a good memory. That's right. And as of March 31st, 2024, their cash and bank balance stood at 5,857 million. And importantly, their management has stated that they believe they have enough financial resources to keep operating under the going concern assumption.
That's definitely reassuring to hear.
It is. But there is a potential issue we need to be aware of.
Uh-oh, what's that?
Biocon has certain obligations related to put options that they granted to financial investors.
Put options. Can you break that down for me a bit?
Sure. Imagine you've got a ticket to a concert, but you're not sure if you'll be able to go. A put option is like having the right to sell that ticket at a set price, even if the market value of the ticket goes down. In Biocon's case, if these investors decide to exercise those put options, it could potentially impact their liquidity.
So it's kind of like a wild card that we need to factor in when we're assessing their overall financial stability.
Exactly. And we also need to remember the broader context here. Biocon is operating in a very complex and ever-changing industry.
Definitely.
And there are all sorts of risks out there that could potentially impact their future success. We've talked about the competitive landscape, but there are also geopolitical risks, regulatory risks. It's a lot to navigate.
It's like they're sailing in uncharted waters, constantly having to adjust course to avoid those storms.
That's a great analogy. And so far, they seem to be doing a good job of navigating these challenges, but their long-term success is going to depend on how well they can adapt and how quickly they can respond to the changing pharmaceutical landscape.
Well said. And that brings us perfectly to our next segment, where we'll dive deeper into some of the key initiatives that Biocon is implementing to try and stay ahead of the curve.
Sounds good.
Let's get into it.
So we've spent some time looking at Biocon's overall performance, but now I think it's time to dig into some of the specific things they're doing that are driving their success.
I'm with you. Let's unpack some of these initiatives. What should we start with?
Well, we can't really talk about Biocon's recent moves without discussing their acquisition of Viatris's biosimilars business.
It was a pretty major move for them.
A major move is right. I mean, it was like overnight, boom, they've got this expanded portfolio, a much larger market reach, and a whole bunch of new infrastructure. All in one go.
It was a big one, yeah.
A perfect example of how a company can use strategic acquisitions to really turbocharge their growth. And then there's their investments in GLP-related API and formulation capabilities.
Okay, remind me, GLP-1, that's the diabetes medication we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what's their strategy there?
Well, remember how we mentioned that a bunch of patents are about to expire on those brand name GLP-1 drugs?
Right, yeah.
Biocon's getting ahead of the curve. They're getting ready to offer those same medications at a much more affordable price as soon as the market opens up.
So they're basically anticipating that surge in demand and making sure they're in a position to capitalize on it.
Exactly. It's really smart planning.
Smart for sure.
And they're also doing some pretty cool things to improve their R&D and manufacturing processes, like using biotransformation and continuous flow chemistry.
Okay, I have to admit, those sound a little bit technical for me. Can you break it down a bit?
Sure. Biotransformation basically involves using enzymes or microorganisms to create more efficient and more sustainable chemical reactions.
Okay, I see.
It's like harnessing the power of nature to actually improve their production processes.
I like that. Working with nature, not against it.
Exactly.
What about this continuous flow chemistry?
Continuous flow chemistry.
Hmm.
That's all about making the production process a lot smoother and more efficient.
Oh, okay.
Think of it like an assembly line, but for chemicals. It helps them produce medications a lot faster and at a lower cost.
I got it. Efficiency is key in a competitive market like this.
Absolutely. But it's not all about the science. They're also doing a lot to focus on their people.
You're right. We can't forget about that side of things.
They seem to be really committed to developing their talent and creating a truly inclusive workplace. For example, they have this program called BioLeap, which is specifically designed to help women advance their careers. And they also have hackathons and comprehensive training programs for everyone.
I love that. Investing in your people is so important.
It shows they're really thinking about the long term. And speaking of the long term, we have to talk about their commitment to ESG.
Absolutely. We touched on this a bit earlier, but let's dig into the specifics. What are they actually doing, and is it really making a difference?
Well, they've got a whole bunch of initiatives in place, things like decarbonization, water management, waste reduction, and also engaging with the community.
It all sounds very promising.
It does, but we'll need to take a closer look to see if it's more than just good intentions. Are they really moving the needle on sustainability?
I'm very curious about that.
Me too. Because, it's easy to talk about ESG.
Yeah,
Actually implementing meaningful change, that's the real challenge.
that's the hard part.
And, when you look at all these initiatives together, the acquisitions, the process improvements, the focus on their people, the ESG commitments, it really creates a picture of a company that's trying to do things differently.
I was going to say the same thing.
Like they're not just content with following the crowd. They want to set a new standard.
I like that. It's refreshing to see.
And it actually brings us back to that multiplier effect we talked about earlier. It seems like they're applying that same kind of multifaceted thinking to everything they do, to their growth strategy, to their operations, to their impact on the world.
It's like they're trying to create a positive ripple effect across the entire healthcare ecosystem.
That's a great way to put it. But of course, with any ambitious endeavor like this, there are going to be challenges along the way. And we need to talk about those risks.
So Biocon's doing a lot of things right, it seems. But no company's perfect. What are some of those risks, those potential bumps in the road they might encounter?
Well, remember how we've been talking about their big focus on biosimilars?
Yeah,
That market, it's getting pretty crowded.
right. They're not the only ones who see the potential there.
Exactly. They're facing some serious competition from both the big established players and some new companies trying to make a name for themselves, both in India and around the world.
So how can they make sure they stay ahead in this race? What are their biggest strengths? What sets them apart?
Well, they definitely have a few advantages.
Okay.
Like, they've got a proven track record when it comes to scientific innovation. They've got a pretty diverse portfolio of products. And remember that global reach we talked about?
Right.
That gives them access to a lot of different markets.
And they're being smart about managing their debt and making sure their financials are strong,
All good points.
which gives them more flexibility in the long run.
Exactly. But the competition is fierce, They really need to keep innovating and finding those strategic partnerships if they want to stay ahead.
Makes sense. Now, what about those geopolitical risks we mentioned earlier? How much could those global events, things outside of their control, really impact Biocon?
Well, think about it. Things like the stability of those global institutions, conflicts between countries, even things like terrorist attacks,
Yeah.
all of that can have a huge ripple effect across the entire pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected our world is these days.
It does. And those kinds of events, they can disrupt supply chains, make it harder to get regulatory approvals, and even shake investor confidence, all of which can hit a company's bottom line pretty hard.
So how prepared is Biocon to handle these kinds of curveballs?
It's tough to say for sure, but it does seem like they have a pretty solid risk management plan in place.
Okay, good.
They're actively trying to identify, assess, and prioritize risks across all of their operations, which is a good sign.
So they're not just ignoring the potential problems.
No, not at all. And that proactive approach, it should help them weather some of those storms that might be heading their way.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are the regulatory hurdles, which are a constant challenge for any pharmaceutical company.
Especially for biosimilars. Remember, they have to go through all these hoops to prove that their versions are very similar to those original, more expensive biologics.
Right.
That means lots of clinical trials, tons of paperwork. It's a big undertaking.
Intense.
And even once a product gets approved, then comes the pricing battle.
Right, because governments and insurance companies, they're always trying to find ways to lower healthcare costs,
Exactly. And that puts a lot of pressure on drug prices.
which can really squeeze those profit margins, especially in a competitive market like this.
It's a tough spot to be in. And then there's always the chance that regulations could suddenly change.
Right. Which adds another layer of complexity.
It's a real balancing act. But from what we've seen, it seems like Biocon has a good understanding of these risks, and they're taking the right steps to manage them.
Yeah, they don't seem naive to the challenges ahead. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From their multiplier effect strategy to their impressive financial performance and their focus on ESG, Biocon is definitely aiming high.
They're not just playing the game, they're trying to rewrite the rules. It's exciting to see.
It's been a really interesting look at Biocon. And I think it's safe to say they've got a bright future ahead of them, as long as they can keep navigating these complex challenges.
I agree. They've got the vision, they've got the drive, and they've got the talent. They can really make a difference in global healthcare. I'll be watching them closely, that's for sure.
Well said. So, what stood out to you in this deep dive? What questions are you left with? Keep thinking about those questions and keep exploring. Until next time, happy deep diving, everyone.